So I'm here to talk as part of the Earth Institute program to talk about my research. I've worked with Jens Carlson here in the Earth Institute, and I'll talk mostly about my own work and exploration, but then draw in some of the things that he and I have been doing together, briefly mentioning that, and talking about in the deep sea how we're moving from an era of exploration to thinking about exploiting deep sea minerals on the seafloor. Oh, deep sea is a beautiful place. It makes up most of our biosphere. It's where most of the biomass carbon on our planet is found. And the animals there are strange. So I'm a biologist. I talk about the animals first. The animals are very strange and very interesting, especially in some of the extreme environments, the hot springs on the seafloor, the cold seeps. Those are the things that I study. And there's also a lot of mineral resources on the seafloor, so that's of interest. The diversity of the fauna is important for thinking about therapeutic agents, chemicals from the sea, that kind of thing. So there's a lot going on down there, and there's a tremendous amount that we don't know. So it's a place still to explore and discover. Oh my goodness. You know, when I was a little kid, I grew up on the coast of New Jersey, so in the U.S., and saw all those weird animals that lived on the coast, the horseshoe crabs we have, and things with more arms and legs than I have, more eyes. And so they fascinated me. And then as I became aware that there was a deep sea. I mean, normally you look out at the sea and you don't really think much about what's on the seafloor. But I started to imagine what those animals were and thought they would be the strangest animals around. And then they discovered hot springs on the seafloor, and there they were, the very strangest animals. These animals, large tube worms without digestive systems that live on chemicals coming out of the ocean floor. That's pretty phenomenal. So I got hooked very early on and was actually started doing field work just a couple of years after the vents were discovered back in the 70s, late 70s. Hot springs, hydrothermal vents, are hot springs on the seafloor. They're places where seawater is percolated down through the crust and reached hot rock and become heated, reacted with the rock, because the seawater becomes chemically modified, picks up a lot of metals, which is why it's important for the exploitation side of things, and comes out, spews out of the seafloor as these hot springs. The temperatures can be 350 degrees Celsius. And it's a very reduced chemistry, so it's carries a lot of potential chemical energy with it. And when that fluid comes out, the oxygen in the seawater can be used to oxidize it, and that creates chemical energy. And the microbes that live down there have figured out how to do that in their cells, and that creates energy from chemicals the same way green plants create energy from photosynthesis as some solar energy. And so that's how these animal communities get started down there. So the hot springs have both the fluid coming out, and that fluid's rich in chemicals that then the microbes in the animals can live on. Cold seeps they're analogs to these hot springs, but they're not formed in any kind of volcanic setting. The way you get hot springs, you must have a heat source. Cold seeps are more, it's kind of a catch-all phrase, but they're found on continental margins, and they are places where organic material has accumulated over eons, and the microbes go to work on it, produce methane, and then the methane can be oxidized by another kind of bacteria to make sulfide. And the methane and sulfide are the chemicals that fuel the animals that live at cold seeps. So cold seeps are continental margin. They're pretty much everywhere where you have any kind of organic input from land and shallow water productivity. And they have similar animals to what we find in the hot springs. So they're related. So it makes those of us who study these chemosynthetic communities are interested in both those cold seep faunas and the hot spring faunas. Yeah, we're doing a project funded by the National Science Foundation, and it's we're really interested in these island-like communities, the hot springs, or in this case, the cold seeps. They're just small patches on the seafloor and populated by animals. The animals all reproduce by putting larvae up in the water column. So we're very interested in how those populations are connected. So Jens is a population geneticist, so we're studying the relatedness of these communities and looking at where the natural population structures are. So where is there a lot of mixing of larvae, and where do they go? So we do it with looking at physical oceanography, look at where the currents go. We look at the larval biology, so we understand where the larvae are in the water column and when, because that tells us where the currents are carrying them. And then we use the genetics to tell really how far they might disperse in any kind of manageable ecological unit. Oh, it's a fantastic experience. It's unworldly. It's like, you watch the NASA astronauts or space astronauts going into the solar, wherever they go, into outer space. And the thing is, they don't get to see life, right? There's no life out there. But for us, we dive to the sea floor, the extreme environment, but there's life there. And so, and it's really quite beautiful life. So we go down and it's cold and dark until you get to one of these hot springs, say, and then the black smokers are billowing. They're fantastic to watch. I wish I could just go down there and take a picnic lunch and only have to watch these things. They're so fascinating. The colors are, at the hot springs and also at the cold seeps, colors are pretty fantastic. There's a lot of hemoglobin, so animals are often red. And so it's red against the black background at the hot springs or against the dark muds of the cold seeps. The cold seeps where we're working with Jens there can be brine pools on the seafloor, so you can have lakes on the seabed. Just a phenomenal thing to think about. If you're away from the sites where the biology is, away from these seeps and vents, then the biology is really pretty subdued. It's very low biomass. But you come onto these, they're like little urban centers and these little islands at seeps and vents. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Oh, good question. You know, the first dive you do, so I wasn't a pilot when I did my first dive, but the first dive you make to the seafloor is the one that stands out most. Because it changes the way you view the world. You get a view of an inside part of the planet. So that was pretty special. There was a time when I got stuck on the seafloor. That was interesting. And then I was just on a dive recently where we had a fault in the CO2 scrubber. So we are down there at 1 atmosphere, and you suck out the CO2, the poisons, with just some chemicals, and it failed. And so we had to go on emergency breathing apparatus. That was memorable. But the biology, you know, it's the first time you see a tube worm, the giant tube worms, and they're thickets of tube worms. So it's very lush, very much like a garden scene. That's very memorable. Black smokers are very industrial. Those are memorable. There's a lot of things that are just, I carry in my mind a view of the world that not so many people have. And when I look at the ocean now, it's basically I drain it and see the seafloor and not all the surface stuff. You know, it's not really research. It's getting people to care about what's down there. So I know, I feel like it's a personal connection to these things because I explore it, and it's very hard to convey to somebody who doesn't get to dive how special these environments are, and also to convey the vastness and you know it's this idea that 1 square meter of mud and the small animals that live there just in the typical, you know, away from these special habitats, that it's not very interesting, not even to me. Probably isn't interesting to anybody, except maybe my former advisor. But it's when you multiply it by the vast areas of the seafloor that it starts to make a difference. It's unfathomable how much is going on down there. Very slow on a small scale, but it's just over eons and over such a vast area. So how do we get people to care about little tube worms? I mean, I think the giant tube worms are the most gorgeous animals in the world, and then I meet people on the street and they say, "Oh, really? Those are pretty." So how do we get people to care about what's there? Because we will go down and I'm pretty sure we're going to extract ore from there, from the seafloor at some point. So how do we do it wisely, and how do we get countries to care and the people who are making the regulations to really think about the environment carefully? I think there's a will at some point, but it's not universal. So I think that's, now as I get to the later stages of my career, it's thinking a lot about how to get people to care. The weirdest thing, golly, some of the behaviors of people in the submarine are pretty interesting. You know, I think the Yeti crabs. So do you know about the dancing crabs? There are these, the original Yeti crab is this very furry crab, so it's, you know, we're always looking for that charismatic animal, and we don't have polar bears and panda bears, but these things are very furry, squat lobsters we call them. So we discovered those on the Pacific Antarctic Ridge a few years ago. And then in the southern Atlantic, colleagues in the UK discovered these dancing Yeti crabs, and they go around with wave their arms, and they have hairy arms, and they're waving and collecting bacteria, I guess. I'm not quite sure what they're doing, feeding that way. Very fascinating, because they're there by the thousands, and they all kind of move together. It's really weird.